Subs or dubs?
Okay, this is a real contentious thing.
Hi, I'm Will Webb, and this is Why You Should Watch. In this episode, we're discussing Hayao Miyazaki's 1997 film Princess Mononoke.
In a time when gods walk the earth, an epic battle rages between the encroaching civilization of man and the gods of the forest.
The story of this Japanese animated movie follows the last prince of the Emishi, Ashitaka, who is cursed while defending his village from a rampaging boar god. He sets out to find a cure and discovers a conflict between an industrialized town and the ancient spirits of the forest. Here to discuss the film and tell us why you should watch Princess Mononoke is Hay.
Hello, I'm Hayden. I host the All That Film podcast, and today we are here to talk about a lovely film with Will, Princess Mononoke.
So I'm really interested that you chose this movie. I think a Studio Ghibli film being on the list is great, but I have to confess it's one of the very few I hadn't seen, so I had to watch it for this.
Oh, really?
I mean, I've seen even stuff like Laputa and also non-Miyazaki films, but I was really interested to see that you chose Mononoke, and I know that you've done a video about it on your channel, so I know kind of why you love the film and some of the interesting stuff about it, but I'd love it if you could, first of all, tell us about, I guess, how did you find the film, and in what context did you first see it? You know, how old were you? Where did you see it? Did you see it in the cinema, or was it on DVD?
I don't have a childhood attachment to the Studio Ghibli films, and I know a lot of people. That's why a lot of people prefer the Totoros and Spirited Aways, and I definitely see that when I'm watching them. I think I watched Spirited Away, and then I had seen Castle in the Sky 3 times, and not all of them were necessarily clicking with me from an illustrious studio, especially with Miyazaki himself being this monolith of a director. And then I finally watched Princess Mononoke. I think I was doing laundry, so I was just oh well, I'll put this on for a little bit. If it captures me, I'll finish it. If not, I'll go to bed. And of course, in the first 10 minutes, I was oh, this movie rules. And then I was immediately caught on board. I think it's very, very difficult to do a high concept, fully realized fantasy world. That's why you don't see a ton of successful Lord of the Rings type movies. And this is that. I love the balance of what Miyazaki's doing with each of the characters not necessarily being evil. And tons of people have mentioned the way he's able to change the princess trope. A female protagonist is really, really special, and I'm groundbreaking, honestly.
When I watch Miyazaki's films, I got a joke with my girlfriend where I'm I'm watching an animated film where there's a little boy, a flying machine, and a load of rolling green hills. Who do you think directed it, right? And of course, it's going to be Miyazaki. But actually, when it really comes down to it, I think what defines his films is that relationship between nature and technology, or maybe just progress. I think it's hard to kind of tease out the two. And I think it's interesting in some ways that he's quite a playful and inventive animator while also being quite conservative socially. He's often talking about the past. And so it's interesting you were saying about realizing a fantasy world, because one of the fab things about, and I totally agree about Mononoke being this gorgeous fantasy story and a great bit of world building, but it does draw really heavily on the actual Japanese history.
For sure.
When I characterize Miyazaki in my head, it's about those kind of green hills and then some sort of corrupting influence coming usually into the forest. So you mentioned Laputa. I mean, I just saw that recently, and it was weird going and seeing that after having seen almost all of the rest of Ghibli, because you can start to see those themes come through straight away.
For sure.
When they got up to that kind of corrupted, paradise, really, in the sky, and it's been dead for years, that's this fantastic kind of moment, I think, that you can really see the promise of him as a filmmaker start to come out.
Yeah, that one's interesting just because I feel like that one's the most on the nose of hey, machine's bad.
I have a friend who says that he doesn't like the Ghibli films because there's never any stakes. He's seen Totoro and he's seen Spirited Away, and he doesn't think those are really stakes. But I usually point him to Nausicaa and say, yeah, well, go and see that and tell me how you feel about stakes in Miyazaki's film.
For sure. Nausicaa is like a great example of like, oh, you think like Studio Ghibli is just a slice of life, like, oh, time to hug at the end of it. But as soon as I watched, I forget if it is in the first 10 minutes or not, but someone's like arm gets like ripped off by the monster. And I was like, oh, shoot, this is not like, hey, we're going to play with the little bear monster type movie. I think Nausicaa all the way through is sort of like showing, oh, hey, here's a lot of the bad stuff from war, a lot of the bad stuff from technology. And Mononoke does do that stuff a ton, and it definitely doesn't shy away from those themes, but it feels a lot more like spiritual in like the lore that it's going for. So that's why I was just mentioning with Nausicaa. It just feels like it was like one of his first times delving into that, and it's still like, for the early signs of what Miyazaki was, it's like, oh, this is still great. Keep making more of these.
I mean, it's interesting because I think there's not much natural world in Nausicaa. There's a lot about why technology is bad, but there's not so much about the world they're trying to save. Whereas in this, it's all about that. I think it comes at it from that perspective. Nature isn't a soft force in his world either. It's not like nice. And I think it's the biggest difference between Mononoke and the other Ghibli films I've seen is that there is this real sense of threat. And so it's that sense that in a way, the natural world is as dangerous, but it's natural. Like, it's not a new danger. It's part of the natural order of things, whereas industry and technology and change really seems to introduce new risks.
For anybody that is watching this and is like, oh, well, I don't really like anime, I understand that because I love anime and I understand the tropes, especially like with some of the more mainstream like Shonen Dragon Ball Z stuff. This is definitely like, it's not doing any of those tropes. I know some people have mentioned like, hey, I don't like pervs in anime, and I'm like, totally get that. That's not in Miyazaki's movies.
Lord of the Rings is a really good touch point that I hadn't considered for this, because it's also religious. It's about the failure of like progress and things like that in some ways. As you say, a lot of people have that conception of anime as just being like cat girls and Dragon Ball Z, right? And it's a really good example because it is deadly serious right from the start, and he does not make any defense of his genre. He's like, it's just, you're going to have to take it. So in that way, I think it's a really good introduction to anime. If you're going to start anywhere, why not Mononoke, right? When it came out, it was one of the first widely released Japanese animated films. And it was bought by Miramax. Harvey Weinstein tried to cut 30 minutes from the film, apparently. It had a really big DVD and VHS release. So that actually paved the way for Spirited Away and for the kind of increased interest in Japanese animation. It was one of the things that happened alongside like Adult Swim started running anime at around the same time. So it was like this moment, this cultural moment. And so Mononoke is like a really good jumping on point in that sense, literally because it was the jumping on point for a lot of American and Europeans, yeah.
Part of that is because Bebop and Trigun were like huge, and Dragon Ball Z was really picking up. So people were more inclined to be like, oh, well, what type of movies are in the anime genre? And you're right, it did crazy sales.
I thought you might like to hear this negative review of the film written in the Washington Post at the time of release. Stephen Hunter said of the film, it's as spectacular as it is dense, and as dense as it is colourful, and as colourful as it is meaningless, and as meaningless as it is long, and it's very long. Which I think is a deeply unfair take, because it's a thrilling film and it is 2 hours, but it doesn't feel much like it.
I kind of want to read the full article just to see like how he like got to that, because that's a very like, hey, this movie, like just throwing this movie away.
You mentioned there being earlier anime that people had watched in the States by this point, right? You had Cowboy Bebop and Dragon Ball Z are two really good examples, but there are also examples where the original releases were really heavily Americanized. And with Mononoke, because they had Neil Gaiman writing the script and it had been translated at Ghibli's end, as far as I understand it, originally, there's so much culturally specific stuff in it. It's stuff you can't cut. And so they added in extra lines and things to explain stuff like, like the Japanese touches of it, some of the symbolism that might not be familiar to an American audience. And so I think in some way it's not about... maybe Hunter would have a different review now, having seen more of that genre and more of what Miyazaki's all about. And so that's nice that like Mononoke is a kind of entry point into Japanese culture from an American or European perspective, but both at the time and, makes a good entry point now, I think, as well. Thanks for watching this video. To hear more of our conversation, check out the Indietrix podcast. Just search Indietrix wherever you listen to podcasts to get started.